Hi everyone, David here. We're going to talk about Eastern philosophy today. We're going to talk about some of the teachings of Confucius. Confucius was born in 551 BC in the Chinese state of Lu, what later became Shantung, and he died in 479. Sadly, very little reliable information is known about him, although we do know that ever since his death he has been viewed as something of a sage in contemporary Chinese history. He was born into a poor but noble family, and his father died when he was just a small child. He began his career in his late 20s as a teacher. His goal is not to train people for specific vocations, but to train them in the conduct of moral character. Notably, he was one of the first people in China that we know of who actually devoted his life to this task. The next reliable information that we know about Confucius is that at age 51 he became an assistant public works magistrate in Lu. He became disillusioned by his superiors, however, who did not care about any of his ideas for political reform, and so he left Lu, and he traveled with a group of dedicated students, probably no more than 12 or 14 of them, and he traveled throughout the entire countryside, teaching and giving lectures on his ideas in moral and political philosophy. This plan, too, failed because he was unable to convince any of the governors of the various provinces of his ideas. However, his ideas were not in vain themselves. He actually returned to the city of Lu at the age of 68, and he brought back with him some 3,000 disciples who were interested in his work, including Lao Tzu, Mencius, Hsun Tzu, and others. Indeed, according to many Chinese scholars, the writings of Confucius and his students fundamentally shaped the character of the Chinese people. Now, our interest in Confucius today is not merely historical. One might be inclined to think that even if Confucian philosophy was so instrumental in shaping Chinese life, it is not clear why we should study his writings today. Of course, one is perfectly entitled to reply that we ought to have interest in philosophy for its own sake, and that is a good reply. However, aside from mere intellectual curiosity, we need a reason to give to the critic for why he or she should spend their time studying Confucian philosophy. For one of the complaints that is brought against philosophy in general is that it is too abstract and disconnected to us. We can't offer a full reply to that criticism, but we can say that there is good reason to think that the critic has asked us to point out the relevance of philosophy. We might begin by saying that Confucianism offers a practical counterbalance to the charge of abstraction in philosophy. For example, Confucius and his disciples asked about and gave answers to some very difficult questions about how we should treat authority or how we should treat our parents. Other questions pertain to having respect for our elders or how to handle disagreements between two peers. Moreover, Confucius believed in the importance of having firm first principles about government. He thought that it was especially important that the just be set up over the crooked and rule them as opposed to the other way around. One way to approach the dialogues of Confucius and his disciples is to consider them as sort of analogues to Plato and Aristotle, the scholars and philosophers in the West who have had such an influence over us in our ethical systems. Of course, that is not to imply that Confucius held exactly the same philosophical views on subjects such as Plato and Aristotle did. Moreover, the dialogues of Plato and his students and opponents are often more difficult to read than those of Confucius and the ANALECTS. Even so, there are a lot of similarities, and arguably the most important of which concerns the fact that one of the best ways to learn philosophy is to exchange ideas. Now, in one sense, perhaps, Confucius was more of a combination of Plato and Aristotle than resembling either one separately. For example, like Plato, he cared about discovering the good and moral truth, and very much like Aristotle, Confucius cared for understanding the application of ethics to everyday life. So far as we know, Confucius wrote very little on metaphysics, but neither did he deny metaphysics. Like the Roman philosopher and statesman Cicero, Confucius spoke piously about the gods, but he thought that as a statement of humility, it would be best not to speak too much about the gods for fear of making any false statements about them. As previously stated, there is an analogue between the dialogues of Confucius and the dialogues of Plato. Both profoundly were preoccupied with how we discover what principles we might live out virtuous lives as moral beings. Arguably, this demonstration of the universality of philosophical inquiry for the search for moral truth is something that we can attach great significance to in the writings of Confucius. That these men across continents discovered common principles of ethics through a combination of experience in everyday life and careful reasoning ought to be something that strikes our attention. It's also notable that the writings of Confucius and the Analects are very easy to read in comparison to those of Plato's dialogues. One reason is that Confucianism is almost entirely a system of applied ethics. Indeed, when one first reads the Analects, it is easy to be led astray by the historical and religious references which seem so foreign to our Western ears now. So it is especially important to remember that there is genuine moral philosophical ideas contained in these writings, and that many of the lessons which Confucius taught to his disciples, and many of the things which he learned from his discussions with them, can apply to our own 21st century lives as well. One of the first things that we need to know about the Confucian moral system is that it is decidedly altruistic in its character. Now, without getting into too many of the difficult questions of altruism and egoism, the meta-debate that goes on in ethical theory, it's worth briefly mentioning the foundations of Confucian morality. Now, what does it mean to say that Confucian morality is altruistic? Well, Confucius upholds the virtue of zhen, which for our purposes means compassion or loving others. Suppose that someone comes to Confucius and says, "But why should I have compassion for my fellows?" Here it is important to note that Confucius adopts a view of morality which is founded on certain facts about the way we are as human beings. There are parallels here with Aristotle which we cannot consider today, but the basic notion is that we should look to facts about commonalities that humans have with each other when thinking about why we should love and care for other people. What we know is that in the paradigm cases where there are no neurobiological abnormalities in the structure of our cognitive processes, we as individuals wish to achieve success in our lives. As individual persons, the reason we can achieve success in life, in principle, is that we have the capacity for learning from our mistakes and improving. These are goals which we all have in common. The next fact about us that is important is that the kind of beings that we are mean that we tend to attain success because we learn how to improve ourselves in a larger social context. In particular, the most basic social unit is the nuclear family. We learn social skills of cooperation within the family structure first. If we act out of selfishness all the time, then we will find our capacity for learning and improvement would be substantially hindered. But we can learn to retrain our minds and become more altruistic. But how can we do this? Confucius was aware that there are limits on the extent to which we can become more altruistic. Even so, he noted that certain practices can shape our moral character. Acquiring li, or self-discipline, is how we achieve this goal. Li means studying the rituals and rules of propriety in our culture, in our society. And the reason why they invoke self-discipline is simply because they are rituals and rules which we have not made as individuals, but which we follow, and which we may not fully understand ourselves. In one way, we can think of li as politeness. We can think of li as an important aspect about the moral foundations of politeness. The fundamental principle of li is that the rituals and rules of politeness exist because they express moral value as well as being externalized as social value. There are facts about the kinds of beings that we are externalized. The desire to be polite, when it is present in us, expresses the deep value we have for the lives of others, given the values that we have as individuals about attaining success. Confucius embraced a sort of metaphysical realism of the sort which Plato embraced. He held that the terms that we use actually pick out, or fail to pick out, important concepts in the world. The challenge he faced in his day was false piety. That is, many of the rulers of his day used important terms such as benevolence, virtue, love, honor, honesty, but the actions that these men did not reflect the meaning of the terms which they used. We need moral education grounded in the self-discipline of Li in order to rectify the situation that we face in a society in which people use words without meaning. The self-discipline that we achieve will allow us to see the particularly vivid ways in which abuses of language and the loss of original meaning have occurred. What's more, self-discipline will make us more sensitive to the needs of society as a whole, rather than concentrating on the very narrow selfish goals that we may have. When we fail to discipline ourselves as individuals, then the entire society suffers. As persons begin to live strictly for today, for the moment, for the here and now, there can no longer be long-term social continuity in a system of mutual trust, for mutual trust declines as a consequence. Confucius would certainly have a lot to say about our commercial society in the West, and not necessarily all of it positive commentary either. He would have a lot to say about our dominant preferences for frivolous vanity items, for our insistence on snapping selfies at every hour of the day, for our insistence on scanning through endless Twitter posts and general distaste for reading works of literature and philosophy. Now, that is not to say that Confucius would necessarily oppose the buying of products. He was a very practical man. And it's not to say that he would oppose the idea of taking a selfie and then sending it to maybe a sick relative to brighten up their day. Nor is there any reason to think that Confucius would oppose social media. What he would oppose, the state of affairs which arises when we prize social media above our deeper interpersonal relationships. He would recognize and be sympathetic to the fact that sometimes we say things that we don't mean to, and sometimes we post things on the internet that we don't mean to. But he would be alarmed by the sight of whole lines of thoughtless and often cruel posts directed at other persons on our part, which were a routine part of our day, for the simple reason that this would suggest that such was a part of our character. All of these are the marks of the society in which many of us as individuals have manifestly failed to morally discipline ourselves and our appetites. Some might be inclined to dismiss these worries as the reactionary ideas of a cantankerous old man, but it is important to remember several things. First, Confucius devoted his entire life to learning to become a more virtuous person, which is more than we can say for ourselves in most cases. Secondly, Confucius's writings are intended to warn us about the real-world consequences which result when we fail to be guided by the self-discipline of the moral ethics of Li. I don't want to leave this video on a negative note. As a preview for the next video, in ancient Eastern philosophy, when we investigate the analytics, we will find a patient and understanding teacher who thinks that the greatest potential of human beings can be realized in moral character and in moral action. Until the next time, I would like to continue to encourage you to seek truth and to pursue the examined life.